going to. Well, hey, thank you so much for having us. I'm Terry Kelly from UAA, and Stephanie and I have been writing together for the last couple of years, working on areas of professional ethics and applied ethics. And so our paper is called The Good, the Bad, and the Ethical, the interplay between moral principles and the ethical commitment in social roles. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I go to an academic conference and someone gives a paper in which they really have no good arguments for, and they're just about making it up as they go along, they often start with a very dramatic claim like, this is a broad programmatic statement of an exciting research program in philosophy or something. Have you all seen that? So this is a broad programmatic statement of an exciting area in research philosophy. Let's start with a case. Boethius Jones. Boethius Jones is a lawyer representing a defendant in a sexual assault case. The victim of the crime gives testimony that's damaging to his client. Boethius knows that the witness is being truthful, but notices that the witness is very nervous and could probably be easily rattled during cross-examination, right? And in legal ethics, this is called the problem of impeaching the truthful witness. Would it be ethical for Boethius to go ahead and aggressively cross-examine the witness, rattle her, and kind of convince the jury that either she's lying or at least is unreliable, right? And so one could imagine some arguments, in fact you don't have to imagine, they're out there. Here are some of the arguments that are typically thrown around about whether this is ethically permissible or not. So one argument is what we call the deception argument, right? Deception in matters of justice is wrong because, now insert your favorite normative theory here, and impeaching a truthful witness amounts to an effort to deceive the jury. Of course, you might also think, yes, in the argument here might run something like, the client has a right to legal advocacy. Why do they have such a right? Again, insert your favorite normative theory here, and that advocacy is only limited by what's forbidden in a reasonably just legal system. Impeachment of the truthful witness is allowed in this legal system, presumably being reasonably just. Therefore, it's not only permissible, but required, right? And so this is actually the strong claim that you get from people like Monroe Friedman and the like, that not only is impeaching this witness permissible, it's actually required. Anything less and you're shortchanging the client. What we're interested here is not adjudicating between these two arguments, but seeing them actually as fellow travelers. And both of these arguments, we'll call them the deception argument and the right to advocacy argument, are, in our terminology, they are moral arguments. They're moral arguments in our view because they rely on abstract principles justified from an impartial and ideal perspective, and these principles are meant to be universal in scope. We might take the utility principle or the categorical imperative as examples. Secondly, the arguments tend to be deductive. They move from establishing universal principles and then deductively moving down to the case. And so in many cases, it's mostly a matter of application. Is this case appropriate for this principle, or how does the principle get applied in this particular case? Now, we could imagine some other kinds of arguments, though, that might appear when Boethius is thinking this through. And in fact, if you were to talk to lawyers about this, these would actually be some of the more typical arguments that you might hear. Boethius is a decent guy, and he cares for his client, that's true, but he does care for this truthful witness as well. He understands that this truthful witness is potentially the victim of sexual assault. In fact, Boethius may know that she is the victim of sexual assault. And it just doesn't sit right with him to, in some sense, further her humiliation. And so while he says, I know some lawyers that do it, it's not particularly my way. It's not the way I do things. Again, we could imagine Boethius taking the opposite view. Yes, as a lawyer, I'm a kind of friend to my client, right? So I don't think in terms of rights and duties, but I'm a kind of friend. I'm the legal friend of my client. This is Charles Freed's famous view of a lawyer as friend. And I know my client needs me. And I don't like impeaching this witness, but loyalty is important, and loyalty is about doing things that are hard sometimes, maybe even distasteful. Again, we're not going to adjudicate between these two arguments, but what we want to point out is that these arguments are very different from the first set of arguments that we looked at. These arguments, and we'll call these the care for witness and the loyalty to client arguments, are in our vocabulary ethical arguments. They're ethical arguments because they begin with contextual commitments within relationships. The arguments tend to be contextualist, right? So Boethius reaching conclusions mostly that apply to him, given his situation and his character. And the arguments make use of emotional attitudes, right? So certainly something that from the moral perspective tends to be forbidden, especially those who are deontologists. So one could imagine then, so we've got these two different perspectives that one can take on trying to resolve ethical questions, the moral perspective and the ethical perspective, and there's at least 4 different positions that one could take about their relationship. Moral reductionism is the view that only the moral perspective produces oughts, duties, and rights. And so for the moral reductionist, if Boethius wants to understand what he ought to do, then what he needs to do is apply the categorical imperative. He needs to reason exclusively from the moral perspective. Any context or emotion or sense of one's own character will taint your moral reasoning, right? Those of you who know Kant, you might think about the kind of case that if you were to act out of love, even if your action is what would be recommended by the categorical imperative, if your motivation is ultimately emotional, love, then your action is legal in his parlance, but not moral, right? So it loses its moral worth, right? With the exception, I know what you're thinking, what about the main emotion that's produced by morality? And Kant says, yes, there is an emotion produced by the categorical imperative, pain, right? So the categorical imperative causes you pain by thwarting your self-inclinations, and that's what gives you respect for the moral law. So Kant and many Kantians would be moral reductionists, and the same is true for utilitarians. And so I want to point out that I think both of the main schools right now in the English-speaking discourse on ethics, both of these schools would hold this view. As you know, it's something of an issue for utilitarianism. Why is it permissible that I spend more of my time and more of my resources with my friends, or with my children, or with my parents? Surely the principle of utility requires promoting the general good, right? And so what allows that kind of particularism, right? And both Mill and Sedgwick very famously sort of struggle with this, right? And try to offer arguments about, and in some sense, the arguments they arrive at are like very, very foreign to our everyday experience. Both Mill and Sedgwick agree that at the end of the day, it is permissible to be partial to our friends because we know them better, and our actions are more likely to promote good for them, right? And I don't know about you, but I don't show favoritism towards my son because I think to myself, well, I know him better and I can more efficiently promote his good, right? I show favoritism because I love him. So the other view that you could take in a second perspective would be ethical reductionism. The ethical reductionist argues that there is no moral perspective. The ethical is the only normative perspective. Again, you might think a lot of contemporary feminists hold this view. Maybe someone like Bernard Williams holds this view. Perhaps someone like Roger Ames holds this view. Separatism, and the separatism is actually pretty popular in professional ethics, holds that the ethical and moral are different perspectives and they produce separate moral judgments. And so you can arrive at these very, very difficult dilemmas, and they're almost incommensurable dilemmas for the separatist. That the ethical can tell you one thing, let's say couched in terms of virtue and promotion of goodness, and the moral can tell you something else in terms of rights and duties. And there really is no way to adjudicate these, right? So when this occurred, Hegel called this the unhappy consciousness, right? The person who cannot integrate the particular and the universal perspectives. But someone like Hegel himself, I think, is an integrationist. The moral and ethical are, in fact, different perspectives, but they are dialectically interrelated. Now, the moral reductionist believes that the ethical perspective is essentially an aesthetic perspective. It only can tell you what people's inclinations are. It can't tell you what you ought to do. So for the moral reductionist, for say Kant, the ethical perspective has no normative force. For the ethical reductionist, they deny that there actually is a moral perspective. There is no view from nowhere, as Hegel would say, that can justify universal moral principles. Secondly, decontextualization of our ethical thinking can lead to a kind of moral fanaticism, this is Hegel's term, that does violence to the substance of our lives. Imagine, again, I'm going to be an equal opportunity abuser, two examples that people typically take as absurd conclusions of Kantianism and utilitarianism. Kant's famous example of the murderer who arrives at your door looking for someone, that person is actually watching TV in your living room. Can you lie to the would-be murderer? Kant says, of course not, right? What? But you might also take Peter Singer's argument about famine, that if I know there are people in the world who are in famine, then I should give my belongings, I should give towards relief efforts to the point of marginal utility. Remember, the first essay argued to the point of marginal utility, well, meaning what? To the point where I'm just above the famine victim, right? Well, what about my children? What about my marriage? What about my career? What about my life projects? All of them must go. So as Kant does say, right? Let the heavens fall so that justice may be served, right? So, and then finally, abstract universal principles do a poor job of handling our obligations within personal social roles. And again, this would be the idea of why do I have obligations to my children? Why do I have obligations to my older parents? Is it really because of a principle of utility? Is it really because of a deontological perspective? Or is it because of things like that emotional attitude, contextual relationships, human flourishing, things like that? So here we have the perils of co-ownership, because Stephanie and I come at this project and we work together from somewhat different perspectives. Stephanie is a contemporary feminist, and so the ethical reductionism to her, that's just mainstream feminist theory right now. And so she's all about this. In fact, she would add to the critique of the moral perspective that it's inherently sexist, right? That this idea that there are these rules, and I can kind of calculate with these rules and turn the crank and arrive at an answer, inherently sexist and incoherent. On the other hand, you can see my bubble, that's the epitaph that's on Kant's grave. And so, as a Kantian, I am a Kantian, something of a Kantian. I have concerns, right? So I have concerns about ethical reductionism, but for the purposes of this paper, we have agreed that we are going to be ethical reductionists. But, all right, so it's going to be ethical reductionism, but we're going to argue that ethical reductionism will not be enough. It's going to be it's going to need to be enriched by some idealized principles for a number of reasons. The expectations within our relationships and social roles are often ambiguous, right? It's not often clear within our social roles what the expectations are. We occupy multiple social roles, and those social roles can conflict, and so we may need, in fact we often do need, some way of adjudicating the various expectations that come from our various social roles. And then finally, the practice of our social roles at times may require reform, right? So just because this is the way the role has been traditionally done, doesn't necessarily mean that's the way it can continue. So for Boethius, it might be worth for him to engage in what we're going to call reconstructive morality. It might be helpful for him to ask, what is the nature of my social role? Why does my community have this role? Is this role justified? And what exactly would be that justification? And again, so notice, as reconstructive, the main idea here is that the answers to these kind of questions would not come from the view from nowhere. So we would not be asking what is sort of like the Platonic essence of being a lawyer.